Excellent. Thank you so much. There was an amazing amount of overlap, complementary engagement, and interesting intersections between the three speakers. We will be opening the floor to Q&A, but I'm going to take the rather selfish opportunity to ask one or two questions at the outset. One of them was scales of temporality and relations of temporality. All of you spoke about the various antecedents that lead to this vision, and I mentioned some as well in the introduction. And Tobias's kind of ends up as well by positing that maybe the smart city is going away in and of itself, and that maybe this vision is not as bankable as it once was. Because there is a way, when we were first knocking around the idea of smart cities, that I felt it was a bit passé. And so I'm wondering, to what extent is this still a thing that's out there, or is it metamorphosing into something else? And how might various trajectories, either from the latter part of the 19th century or go further back to colonial experience, in which colonial experimentation was then conducted in the field and then brought back to the cosmopolitan center. What is the past here? What is the present? And what might be futural about what we're looking at with regard to smart cities?
Maybe I could just say a few words there. I think what's startling is, as I would stress, the ways in which these sort of bandwagons, these policy bandwagons centered on some sort of intersection between the urban and the mediated, with land at the core. And I think we need to stress the political economy of land and real estate as being fundamental here. Those things have a very short half-life. You know, the discourse on the knowledge city, the discourse on the creative city, the discourse on the smart city, they come and go with extreme speed and become dated and passé almost before they're out there. And yet, they tend to be just replaced by something new. There'll be some new guru emerge, some Richard Florida-like figure invoking some other adjective that is effectively a similar sort of elitist, land and real estate-driven vision for neoliberal urban planning, which will then be sprayed onto every city around the world. And I go to these planning conferences where you can see a discourse and a bandwagon almost dying on its arse, as we say in Britain, and the new one emerging, and there becomes a new celebratory rhetoric. And a lot of the problem is the strange passivity of imitation, and the way these things, as you brilliantly say, Tobias, just become sort of cookie-cutter models of innovation with a land, and I think we need to emphasize again, the land and real estate, the political economy of land and real estate is what drives a lot of our economies these days. And the financialization of that political economy is at the heart. So if you can add a spin and a narrative around futurity, around high-techness, around innovation, however crass and superficial, at the bottom line, this is about adding value to land and real estate, very often, financialized through global financial circuits. Right?
Yeah, and the land is always seen as kind of, as you were talking about, as a tabula rasa, that, you know, there's no environment that's been unbuilt in order for us to build this.
Yeah, which is as old as the hills.
Yeah, for me, I think in as far as these are kind of technically driven or technicist futurisms, there are patterns of reinvention which I track through the technosciences, through AI, through A-Life, through the failure and the recuperation of the failures attached to those projects that become ambient intelligence, and so continually resurfacing actually with fundamentally similar or similarly bogus claims about automated systems and what have you. At the same time, I think there is at the moment a kind of real political regression to the 50s, particularly in gendered terms, which a lot of feminist theorists have picked up on in diverse ways. And you know, through iconography to non-ironic, ironic sexism, you know, the very, very complex and problematic relationship between feminism and neoliberalism is a big factor here for me. But also, I mean, when I think about the antecedents, I have to think too about the strategies, which were evoked from by Tobias as well. The sci-fi that wasn't ever celebratory as much as hugely cynical and funny and critical and clever. And I think, including H.G. Wells, Stanislav Lem has been mentioned. We've had obsequious lifts, depressed robots, and talking doors that demand cash for opening and closing, which Adam Greenfield cites brilliantly from Philip K. Dix-Ubik. And, you know, this tells us a lot. I don't really like the prescient thing in the relationship between science fiction and science. I don't think they're sufficiently disentangled to really talk about it that way. But I think that there are critical and creative strategies in there for debunking. And I have to say, although I totally agree with you about your frustration with notions of smart that are obsolete before they've begun, which are branding terms and all the rest of it, I also think it's hilarious. I can't think of the smart home, you know, the smart kitchen, without being at the same time furious and cracking up.
And all those visions were very neatly articulated in all sorts of popular magazines in the 50s, like Popular Mechanics and Mechanics Illustrated.
And there are narratives galore and iconographies.
And all those images are straight out of those pages.
They are. They are. And there's really mileage. I think strategically there's really a lot of mileage in there. And
Histories of the Future, right?
Yeah, Future Past.
There's a great book called by James Corn on Histories of the American Future, and it's you can take the images straight out of that and plonk them onto some part of South Korea, and hey, off you go.
So really, with those attentions to real political harms and geographical discrepancies, I think there's much to be made of humour, absurdity, technological failure, hubris.
Yeah, well, it writes itself, doesn't it?
Exactly. Well, exactly, and then you have your dissension or opportunities.
Underscore.
I'm an opportunist.
We're gonna have to talk later about my ongoing campaign against Future Vision videos, which has a Tumblr. The thing about temporality that strikes me is when I've through my professional life been involved in smart cities in some way or another at several points, and they always seem to begin with the kind of once upon a time in a galaxy far away line, which is by 2050 6 billion people will be living in cities. As if, oh right, so now we better get on with it, right? And we'll all be connected. Unequally. All those 6 billion people will be connected and living in cities.
Desperate for a fridge that orders its own milk.
Exactly, and there is a chronic lack of internet-connected fridges, and that's something we have to deal with. I think that's quite prescient. I mean, the point is that I think there's something about the rendering of the smart city that's so Moorish to policymakers and technologists. It's like, if we just go for that, everything will be fine. And you just want to go and grab them and just be like, come on, like climate change, dude, come on, let's come back a bit and deal with the thing at the moment.
Okay, great. I mean, I could go on, and because I'm infinitely enamored with the sound of my own voice, but let's open it up to the floor and get some questions from you guys for them. Yeah, there we go. Shed some light on the matter. Anybody have any comment? Yeah, here comes one. Winging in from the wings.
You all seem to be talking very top down, and it's really interesting to think about what happens to people who actually live inside these smart cities. And one of the examples I can think of is the Long Live South Bank campaign, where the skateboarders have actually stopped quite a big redevelopment of the South Bank to actually preserve their own space and create their own culture. And that's because they've lived inside that space and inside that city for quite a long time. And I just want to see, because I've just come from the Internet of Things discussion where we've been encouraged to make our own sort of responses to smart technologies. So how do you look at citizens who actually are growing up inside a smart city, changing it for themselves?
No, it's a good question.
I think there's a great example in Malaysia, actually, where there's a 30-kilometre new city built south of Kuala Lumpur, which the rhetoric was all about. It was going to be a smart corridor, a multimedia super corridor, and all of that stuff. And it became, the fetish was that this was going to be some great big new Silicon Valley. We've heard it 1,000 times before. The reality here is that there's a huge amount of very routine labor, often highly disciplined labor, often very low value added labor, and the realities there are all sorts of complex sort of transgression strategies by labor forces that are totally antithetical to these high-level knowledge workers that were all in the brochures. So you get these weird disjunctures once the materiality of often call center-based, routine, software-based industries with their labor practices coexist with the continuing rhetoric. This is all going to be a bunch of Bill Gates' inventing the next software miracle. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right that there needs to be a lot more attention on the sort of quotidian lives of the inhabitants and their strategies and practices situated within these broader sort of places, yeah.
For me, that's what I was trying to allude to, I think, with this notion of a kind of divided strategy within feminism, which attends to harms and lived experiences and time as clock time and the proliferation of labour. There's a deal of writing about those conditions, but for me, just a little bit too opposed to the more kind of fantastic end of somehow escaping or dealing with those harms through notions of more affirmative engagements with these technologies and these worlds. And for me, you know, there's real tension there that needs to be attended to strategically.
I think, well, I live in London as well. I'm pretty familiar with London's ongoing toxic housing crisis. We had the housing protests yesterday, where a couple of thousand people marched across London to prevent 2 massive developments. The problem, I can only speak really for London in that sense, but the problem there is that there's a sort of crushing sense of inevitability and that someone else has a bigger plan than you, and that's already been set in motion and there's not much you can do. I don't really know what the get out for that is. I think things like humour, and we had a panel about infrastructure yesterday and stacktivism, and we talked a lot about the use of humour and subversive mimicry and satire and all sorts of kind of tactics that fall outside the range of behaviours of people who might regulate those spaces so that you can start to subvert how you can act in them. I'm not sure exactly what that looks like on a very ground level, but yeah, it's a hard time. It's not pretty.
No, it's not. But I like your different discursive and rhetorical strategies in thinking about comedy, both of you. Okay, other questions or comments? Yep, here comes one.
Hello, thank you very much for the talk. I just want to make a comment. I also came from the Internet of Things session, and it's very interesting to think of Janet and Jennifer in juxtaposition with Jasmine, I think we had in the previous session, who was the hostess of the alternative home and also the model who carried with no voice the frames or whatever. So it's interesting to see of how even in alternative visions we still have these gendered kind of issues that we need to discuss and bring to the surface as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, part of the problem, I think, with strategies predicated on satire or parody or irony are the problems that we've always faced. Yeah. And we know very well about, critical distance, which is, I think, why, I kind of alluded to the manifesto, particularly the parodic manifesto or the retold story, as a kind of opening to the political, more or less, and a kind of recognition of a degree of helplessness, whilst, kind of, in a sense, having to engage on the terms in which, as Harrow would have it, with the trouble we're in. And this for me is the trouble we're in. And so I know, in a sense, of no better strategy than to start with Janet.
Yeah. On the bigger urban scale, I think we need to be very, very aware of Athens and Madrid as we speak, and the incredible success of of really radical democratic movements that are trying to change the sort of political economy of financialization, austerity, land and real estate that are providing the broader sorts of dynamics that are making housing unaffordable, that are separating housing markets from labour markets because of the ways in which housing becomes a global site for investment for the tiny minority of people who have huge amounts of capital as a result of the current logics of development. So we need to situate all of these discussions in terms of a much bigger politics of contestation, which is going on as we speak, particularly in Southern Europe. And who knows what will happen if we get the change in the government at the level of Spain. Who knows what that will do to the Eurozone and to the politics of austerity and to sort of neoliberal geographies more generally. It is an open game, and it's easy to be very cynical and jaded when you see the neoliberalization of cities around the world. But there is real space for challenging these processes. They're not immutable. They're not inevitable, and they're not sort of massive processes of global change that run around the world as if by magic. You know, they're orchestrated through global systems of governance.
Yeah, I mean, I think Tobias's point that there's likely someone out there with a bigger plan is always a worrying one. But I think it is also important to bear in mind that there's nothing teleological about this, even though they're constituted in this way.
There's a question.
Question over there, Ryan?
Hey, I actually wanted to ask some question about, we are here to talk about predict and command the smart cities. Is there any example of smart villages that have been come about? And in those smart villages, how has that been impacting on urban planning and policy makings that you guys have been talking about? And also how, like within smart villages, how the underlying issue that you have talked about of politics of land could be dealt with. What's your, if you could shed lights on that. Thank you.
Well, I think it's a greatly important question, and I mean, I'm not familiar with the sorts of IT strategies that have been sold and boosted in terms of village life or rural life. What is clear, though, is that these sorts of strategies are very much coming in at a space where conventional understandings of the urban and the rural are very much up in the air. We're now living in an age where geologists are on the verge of describing our entire biosphere as constituted through what they're calling the Anthropocene, where the agency of humans is the most important single factor involved in obviously with their technical agents in transforming what used to be called nature. And in that world, it's no longer clear that there is a simple definition or line separating urban from rural, because so much of what goes on in supposedly rural environments is orchestrated through all sorts of metabolisms and processes of agriculture, mining, trade, shipping, waste disposal that are fundamentally related and transposed through urban ways of living. So the politics of what we might call village life and technology in village life are completely bound up in all sorts of processes like that. And also, of course, we now see the mass environmental destruction going on in many of these rural environments, which forces migration into booming cities that can barely cope. So it's a crucial question. I don't have a specific answer, but I think it's a really important point.
I don't think there are smart villages in the sense of this vision of smart, because they fall outside the last mile problem, which is the point at which the cost of installing that kind of infrastructure would never be repaid by revenue from advertising or subscription. That's why we have smart cities, because the population density is so great that, like in the Bayesian model of how your capture all area, there's enough people you would make a profit from installing this surveillance infrastructure and this advertising infrastructure. That's not to say there aren't smart villages that don't fall inside this model. In the UK, there's been a lot of coverage recently because of the last mile problem. There's been a lot of small village communities building their own mesh structures to push the internet into the rural environment, or at least high-speed internet into the rural environment, where where ISPs or whatever would not be bothered about doing it because they would never make a profit off it. Additionally, there seems to be a political turn to hyperlocalism in a sense in Europe, and we mentioned Athens earlier, and Athens' model of the smart city is radically different in the sense that it's being run off the back of a load of activist technologists who are building a giant mesh network and teaching coding and stuff like that. So I don't think there's a smart village in this vision, but there is a smart village that's being structured in the sense of a technologically active and connected, savvy village that's run by the community that might live there. I don't know where you've gone. You're over there. Okay.
I would be a little bit cautious in me answering that question because I can't really handle the specifics of it. But I would say a little bit in echo to Steve that the notion of that Anthropocene for me does not afford us useful strategies with respect to those sorts of questions. I think it's too easily polarized into a kind of recourse to humanism on the one hand, a survivalism in big history, for example, and on the other hand, a sort of a rather narcissistic fatalism, which suggests, that this is the end of man and kind of means the very opposite.
Okay, we have time for at least one more question.
Hi, I wanted to actually challenge a couple of things that you guys have said this morning.
Challenges aren't allowed. So.
One is the idea that the fact that the idea of the optimized or smart city has been around for so long is a way to discredit the idea. Couldn't it also be proof that this is something that is surviving a long time or that's highly desirable? And second, Tobias pointed to this example of these trash bins that target advertising as a way that smart cities are just being used to do things that are not useful for people, but you also said that people hated it and they got removed. So isn't this actually an example of how those things don't survive?
Yeah, to respond to both points, I think what I was trying to, it's the vision that's the point rather than anything else, in the same sense that the idea of the optimized, efficient city has been around for hundreds of years. Someone even mentioned Hausman on Twitter.
Yeah, it goes way back.
That was you. Well done. 5 points. It's never really achieved. That's what I meant, I think, in my last comment about the smart city always receding into the future. It's always a vision that is never realized. And the same is with the smart bins. It's like the idea was great. In the boardroom, everyone was probably really excited about it. You put it on the street and it doesn't pan out the same way. So although, you're right, people got rid of them because the vision doesn't gel with reality. And the smart city, in the sense of these renderings, will probably never come to fruition because the rendering just simply doesn't gel with the reality of the urban environment and the political situation that we're in, I think, for me.
I think the key is the visions are totalities, and they are about reinventing urbanism as some sort of tabula rasa in a sort of communicational sense or informational sense. And we all know that the realities of urban life is much more messy and contingent and unpredictable, much more the sort of bricolage of all sorts of systems that more or less work occasionally, which sometimes don't work. What's so powerful is that the endless re-emergence of the same visions of this time it will work continually emerge without looking into the lessons of the functionalist city, or the Haussmanized city, or the knowledge city, or whatever. There's a continual amnesia about looking at the sort of fine-grained, situated practices of how technoscience and immateriality and humans work together in cities, which is always much more about repair, improvisation, creativity, and kludges than it is about these grand narratives and big systems. So I think that's where I'm frustrated. I'm not saying that positive things can't come from these sorts of assemblages and negotiations, but we need to start from a very different place rather than these totalizing, often masculinist narratives that we endlessly seem to see reappearing again and again because there's such a supply push, because there's so many dollars to be made on the real estate, and because the urban planning communities are so sort of obsessed by the brand value of these visions and narratives.
Absolutely. I mean, futuristic fantasies endure. You know, that they endure especially when it's expedient, when you know, the fantasy is instrumental and instrumentalizable. Is rather like the panopticon, I suppose. We didn't build the exact one, but we built some like it. Yeah, and we keep trying. Yeah.
Okay, you get to have the final question.
Okay. Thank you for your presentations. This is a question for Stephen Graham. I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about the over-elasticity of the word panopticon coming from New York. I know, like, whenever there's an exhibition of any structure that's vaguely in the form of a tower, people will call it a panopticon, and the word seems to have been dematerialized. I mean, the whole concept was rooted in architecture, right? And now it's become dematerialized, like academia is a panopticon, heteronormativity is a panopticon, which I'm fine with, but I'm wondering if it's becoming one of those words like surreal, right, where it means everything so that it means nothing. It's basically a way to say, if I don't like something, then I'm just going to call it a panopticon. It's like a pejorative epithet, and I don't suggest that you're using it gratuitously, but I'm curious if you or anybody have any thoughts on the over-elasticity of the word.
I wish you hadn't asked a panopticon question. That was...
I'm involved in a journal, a web journal that some of you may have come across called Surveillance and Society, and we've been running it for nearly 20 years now, and inevitably in that subdiscipline, very, very diverse bunch of people, we just got utterly sick of the P word, as we'd call it, and I'm shocked with myself that I just threw it around a little bit in that presentation. I completely agree that it's thrown around far too easily and metaphorically and loosely, without a real careful engagement with the specific histories of disciplinary power and architecture. And yes, we need to abandon the word and abandon its sort of sloppy, generic use. And I think Deleuze is very clear in terms of many of his writings, particularly on control societies rather than disciplinary societies. But we don't want to what I want to stress is that we don't want to abandon engagements with physical architectures and bodies, because too much of the digital discussion has completely abandoned some of the really serious and important discussions about buildings and power. We need to look at how buildings and power and bodies merge through all sorts of remediations with digital technologies in a very, very wide range of ways that are not captured by panoptic discourses at all. And we need a post-Foucauldian and a post-panoptic discussion of all of those things. Yeah.
Anybody else? No, that sums it up quite neatly. We do need to be more critically engaged at all levels. And it just leaves me now to say, thanks to the wonderful presentations, and thanks to all of you for coming. And let's thank the panelists in the traditional manner.